Kande, Steve, thank you so much. This was amazing. And it's very interesting how life can teach us some lessons in real time. You were talking storage, and Steve's mic had an energy storage issue in real time. So we had a great example. And our final session here today, it's very appropriate because it's about resilience. And I really want to give a round of applause to all of you who still are here because you are very resilient. This is, again, a real-time example of resilience with all of you here today. We will do the following. I will call our speakers to join me here on stage. I will moderate this last session. I believe you will remember, we issued at the end of 2021, GFCC Framed the Future, a report that called for action along 5 key drivers for future growth: innovation, sustainability, inclusiveness, partnerships, and resilience. So this is our 5th pillar, the 5th one that we'll be addressing here today. And it's my pleasure to call on stage Professor Ioannis Kokoris from Queen Mary University, London, my colleague and friend Gianna Sagazio from the Brazilian National Confederation of the Industry, my partner in crisis and in innovation, Kazuyushi Shimada, Director of Japan Science and Technology Agency, my new friends and colleagues, Georgi Kiro Giannis, who's a Director General for the Federation of Greek Industry, and Christopher Allen from the European Commission, based out here of Athens, but someone who has dealt with crisis, not just here, but across the world, from East London to other parts of the planet. This is how we will do the session. There are a few things that I really want to do. The first one is to ask everybody who still is here, please raise your hand if you're not a GFCC member. Please raise your hand if you're not a GFCC member. I have a message for you. Not yet. Not yet. So I have a message for you. You should be. On Monday, we had the GFCC annual meeting. We had people from 22 countries on that day joining us for a conversation. That's the moment when we have all members and fellows or people who can attend. We have footprint in 34 countries today. But we had those colleagues joining us, and to a great extent, our conversation was about crisis and innovation. I think that we heard throughout this conference, the summit, that we're living in a time of crisis. Not just one, but all of them coming together. As Kande has reminded everybody on Monday, all of them are coming together, and they're being experienced in different ways across geographies. In that session on Monday, as a community, we mapped 4 crises that are really hitting in some way or in different ways in the globe. The first one is the climate crisis. The second one is about people and skills, and the mismatch between skills, what's needed in the market, the stocks of skills, how people engage with the economy. The third one was a very interesting case. There are some countries that are not just facing crisis, but the whole model for what they are is in check. We talked Kazakhstan. And we heard here today from colleagues like Anwar and Aldar about what's happening in Kazakhstan. And finally, we talk about the most vulnerable countries in economic terms. They're being hit by climate crisis in proportion more than others. They were hit by the pandemic in proportion, some cases, more than others. So how could we, in some way, address this issue of lifting up those that are more vulnerable in economic terms? Those are 3 topics that stood out. And for this session, what I wanted to do is to change the model a bit, So we will have a mic running, and Vanessa, Joanna, and colleagues will have that mic. I want to invite all of you to pose questions, to make comments from the beginning. And I'll get started with an initial round here with our speakers. Each one of them, they come with different perspectives. And I want to start with you, Shimada-san, with, let's say, with a different question that I have for the other speakers. Because in the GFCC, could you please reset the timer? That would be great, because we're having a time crisis too. You would help me to solve that. Yeah? Well, okay. Yeah, that was a crisis. Yeah, yeah. Okay. That would be fast. So, the GFCC in Japan Science and Technology Agency, the main funder for science and technology in Japan, have initiated a new initiative. We are calling it Innovating All of Crisis. The notion for that is we have different crises, but we just heard during various panels, organizations, people, and countries do innovate in times of crisis. So the question is, what can we learn from past crises? And how could we enhance in organizations, in countries, in cities, the capacity not just to respond, but the capacity to innovate when a crisis hits? We saw that during the pandemic, right? So we have initiated this with Japan Science and Technology Agency. So my first question goes to you, Shimada-san. Why does it matter? Why is Japan Science and Technology Agency concerned with that? Why is Japan? Why are you concerned about crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Roberto. The Japan Science and Technology Agency is a member of the GFCC, and we are a public mission-oriented funding agency in Japan. And our role is making a focal point of collaboration in our society. Considering what to do next is our yearly job every year. And during the discussion about the resilience in Global Federation of Competitive Council, GFCC, our member, Queen's Mary University London and Ioannis helped us to make discussion about the crisis. And it was very interesting comments from his colleague. Crisis is not a disaster. It is a phase shift from one phase to next phase, and that is necessary to make decision. And I thought it was a very interesting concept, crisis, because if we share the sense of crisis among our society, we might be able to create the focal point of collaboration. And recognition of the crisis is very important. That's why we start discussion with Roberto and GFCC members last year. Yeah, I can talk a little bit more later, but this is why crisis matter for us.
Shibata-san, let me ask you one thing. What have you learned from a past crisis that you believe that everybody here should know about? We've been talking about not different types of crises. This is one of the things we've been doing together. There are crises that are caused by natural accidents and events, and there are man-made crises. You've been highlighting things like social crisis, crisis in population and demographics, but also like the crisis that arose from the Fukushima accident. So in those cases, or any other cases that you may think about, what have you learned from a past crisis that everybody here should know to be better prepared to face future shocks?
Right. I would like to ask. I would like to answer very simply. I have one example that we experienced. What can I say? It's a crisis and disaster. East Japan Great East Japan earthquake, and we experienced. We could innovate our society working together more closely between academia and industry and social sectors. And we could prepare many things about the future crisis. I should say future disaster. And yeah, this is one example, yeah.
So it's learning about how a crisis was an enabler, a catalyzer of cross-sector collaboration.
Yeah.
A collaboration that maybe would not happen without that critical shock.
Yeah. Not only for the global issue, but also the local issue. We could use this opportunity to create a focal point of our collaboration.
Thank you for that, Shimada-san. What I wanted to do now, and again, I wanted to invite all of you to insert comments and questions after our first round here. I want to start with you, Ioannis, and then go to other speakers with these two questions that I would like to you, if possible, to address in your remarks, right? Where do you come from? What's your perspective in relation to resilience, crisis, and innovation? And what have you learned? The same question that I asked to Shimada-san. From a previous occasion, a previous happening, a previous situation, something that I have learned that we should all be aware of.
Thanks, Roberto. I think we are aware that crisis, even though it has a bad connotation as a word, means something which is negative, I think it always has opportunities there. And if we see it in that way, I think we can benefit from that type of opportunity. And let me be a bit more specific. If I talk about the business world, a company is under crisis, going bust, it's a very nice asset to be acquired by another company. If I talk about academia, for example, and that's part of what we were doing the last couple of years with pandemic, we had over 2 or 3 months in one summer to change the whole academic pedagogy from face-to-face to online. If we go back to financial crisis, and I go back now 15 years ago, when I was at the competition authority at the time, the competition authority had to adapt to approve acquisition of banks which were going under over a weekend. So the systems adapted. And I think that's something that we should applaud because the systems were agile enough. Even academia, because I joined academia after being out in the real world, as I still call it, but my academic friends do not like me calling it that way. So when I joined academia, I thought that I'm joining a very slow, progressive environment. And I was very wrong about it because what academia showed in the COVID pandemic is that we can be very agile and we can be very pragmatic and realistic. I think the drawback will be, and that would be a real shame, if we forget about everything we've learned, forget about how quickly we can adapt, and we go back to our old ways of doing business. And that's not just for academia, I think that's across the board. If we forget the skills we learned, because Roberto, you mentioned about skills, we had to learn skills. If we forget about what we learned, and we go back to our old selves, all the beneficial aspects that every crisis leaves, I think will be wasted, and that would be a big shame. Understandably, when we talk about regulatory frameworks, legal frameworks, we are always coming ex post the event. So we're only chasing the event. And although we would like to preempt it, as for example, medicine can do, preempt a disease from potentially arising, not just diagnosing it and then addressing it. In the legal framework, I don't think we will ever reach that point. Just because human innovation thinks more creatively than any legal innovation can think before you have the fact that you need to address. That happened in the post-financial crisis. We changed the regimes. We changed the regimes during COVID with the IP flexibility to prepare the medicines, the COVID vaccines. And I think it will always be, for the legal and regulatory work, it will always play catch-up to what is happening. So we will not be able to preempt the next crisis, but we will hopefully be agile enough to come in quickly enough to contain the adverse impact. Let me stop here and happy to expand further.
So the critical thing that you're highlighting is the need for institutional learning. to build capabilities and not to lose. It's like going to the gym. It's like jogging or running. If you don't train, you probably lose your fitness level, right? And you also highlighted this thing about base layers, that technology moves faster than organizations in general, and those move faster than institutional frameworks in the law. Would you have, being an expert on legal frameworks, would you have one recommendation, if you could, let's say, oversee that from an overarching perspective? How could we close that gap? We know that we will have a gap. How could we close the gap between what's happening in the world and what's happening in the world of institutions and legal frameworks? What could we do?
I think we can close the gap, and I'll come back to it for 30 seconds. We can close the gap. What we should also bear in mind is we should not overshoot the gap, because we can close the gap by trying to think a bit outside the box of what could be a future event which can harm the economies around the world. This event will have to be related probably to something that we see now happening. What we should not do is become overly protective, because that can actually lead to constraining innovation, constraining development. The example I have here is a digital world. We have done too little, too late. Europe has done better than the US, in my view, on this. The concern now is that we'll actually overshoot it, and we'll actually become too interventionist and intrusion, too much intrusion now. I think that is the balance the regulatory and institutional frameworks need to find.
Avoid to go into the weeds, develop the capacity to understand in real time what's happening. Thanks for that. Shifting to industry, George, there are different things that we could talk about crisis. We could talk about the crisis in the economy here. We could talk about what happened with manufacturing, distribution, and business during COVID. So what is your perspective? And what is one thing that you have learned from your privileged perspective as an industry leader?
Well, that's a very interesting point of view. If I could name one thing that went wrong during the crisis, is what we call the strategic autonomy of the European Union. COVID exposed several weaknesses of the global supply chain and how it affected the European Union. So if the European Union, the EU industry is to survive, we need to ensure access to competitive energy, competitive raw materials, and security equipment. This discussion has already started around the European Union, and especially it's very spotlight considering the position that the continent is vis-à-vis China and the US as competitors in industrial products. Keep in mind that the increased demand of high-tech technology, composite materials, or raw earth minerals are extremely important to industrial growth. The sufficiency challenge of those materials is already evident in products like superconductors, pharmaceutical products, hydrogen, RES, and so forth. So the idea, the key takeaway from this crisis would be to reduce the Europe's dependency in other sources, especially in technology, materials, food, and energy, and essentially reverse outsourcing as we know it for the last 30 years or so. And we need to develop local or even regional value and supply chains, so instead of outsourcing, shift to near-sourcing.
When you say that, there's one thing that comes to my mind. I was trained as an engineer, and one of the things that we learn is that there are trade-offs in design. In many times you can, I think a great design is one that really breaks some of those trade-offs, right? But when you think about really building local regional capacity, you are thinking about buffering systems, right? There are trade-offs in terms of costs. who's going to pay for that?
It's not quite true. Because in order to be very efficient in near sourcing, your production capacity has to be very high. And this can only be achieved through technology. Having a smart factory or a smart supply chain can provide you this efficiency. And we experience that even in Greece. Major industrial players have changed the operational model. They employ in Industry 4.0 technologies like RFID, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain applications, etc. And this can ensure efficiency locally, regionally, or even internationally. We finished a study a couple of months ago trying to measure the benefits of having a smart factory operating at let's say, a European level rather than a global level. And let me quote just a few numbers. Such companies experienced 60% increase in machine utilization, 30% acceleration of time to market, from designing to market, 30% availability of resources, 100% increase in fleet capacity involving IoT location or fleet management applications. Therefore, it's not a simple, straightforward exercise from outsourcing to from globalization to near sourcing. You have to employ technology in order to maintain international competitiveness. And this couples nicely with the internal organizational changes that have to supplement Industry 4.0. In my experience, Industry 4.0 has less to do with technology and more to do with internal culture and seamless flow of information. If you don't have that, artificial intelligence and IoT simply don't work.
Your point is to use a crisis as an opportunity to challenge assumptions. Is that correct?
As an opportunity to re-engineer basic assumptions and provide a new operating model.
Yeah, so a crisis as an opportunity to design things in a different way and break the trade-offs.
Exactly.
Gianna, I need to tell a secret. So Gianna and I, in addition to being good friends, we come from the very same country. It's called Brazil. Not sure if you have heard about that. But the secret, it's like this. Nobody has ever died of boredom in Brazil. We don't have a single case on record throughout history. So we had many crises in Brazil. Yeah.
I would say that.
And you are a fighter.
Yeah.
And I very much commend you because I know how hard it has been to fight institutions, to fight old thinking, to change legal frameworks. And you've been doing that to advance innovation in the country. But that very same country went super down in the last decade. Let's be honest here.
Yes.
We have Carlos, a colleague from Brazil, here somewhere, right? And Carlos was mentioning some of the universities in Brazil. And just for all of you to have a sense, some of the best private research universities in Brazil that a decade ago had 30,000 students, they now have 10,000. Because of the economic downturn, people were not able to pay tuitions and fees. So this is how hard the crisis is. That has a lot to say to higher education and innovation.
Yes.
So what's your perspective? What have you learned during different crises? And at the same time, being a fighter to change some of the assumptions in society. And what should everybody know from that effort that you've been leading?
Well, I believe that we need to fight, perhaps forever. I don't know. I think that our experience, in our experience, we have many important outcomes for the country. Even if we have so many crises, one over the other, we have a space of dialogue and of construction that is the heart of what is happening, that could be the modernization of Brazil. We, I mean, CNI and the other institutions that participate at May. This movement, the entrepreneurial movement for innovation. So we think in the long term, we have a vision for Brazil. We talk about strategic sectors, how to develop these sectors, and we are offering to the Brazilian government proposals, but very specific proposals. I mean, the draft of new laws in details to support the development of the industry and also of the country. So I think that it's important to continue fighting. We will have many other crises. We know that. It will not be different for this new government because we have an economic crisis. The industry is losing their participation in GDP. Nowadays, we have more than 20%, but we had much more in the past. So I believe that the important here is to have a space of dialogue, again, and construction, that all the sectors can propose and advance together, because no sector will solve all the problems that we have. We know that. The government or the academia or the entrepreneurial sector. So it's very important to be very specific. In our case, we know very well what will be the next step. We started this movement including the innovation in our constitution, and this opened the opportunity to create a new legal framework for science, technology, and innovation. And this impacted many laws, and then we wrote the proposal for the new fund for science, technology, and innovation that liberated a significant amount of money to invest in all the universities, the strategic projects in Brazil, like our accelerator, and also for entrepreneurial projects with FINEP, that is our agency for financing entrepreneurs' projects, and also the academia. Is that? Would you like me to explore other?
No, let me make one comment and check one idea with you. My comment is, I think that over the years, in spite of all the crises, Brazil, an emerging country, Deborah has mentioned that, managed to create the third largest aircraft manufacturer in the globe.
Oh, yes, yes.
So Brazil used to be a food importer in the 60s.
Yeah.
And because the country didn't have money to afford to import food, it started to invest in R&D and became the third largest exporter in the globe. So in spite of all of that, there are some learnings and things. But I think that you brought a different topic that I know connects with what Christopher has in mind. You mentioned this, a space for dialogue.
Yes.
And you are leading May, the mobilization, entrepreneurial business mobilization for innovation that you lead. I was not in Brazil. I was outside of Brazil when you took it over. And I can fairly tell that it gained momentum under your leadership. It became more active. It got more visibility. So my takeaway from what you said is that in a time of crisis, we need dialogue platforms. We need to create the platforms for sectors to, and whatever, for people and different segments of society to come together. And especially, it can be burning outside, but you cannot lose that perspective of coming together to, and you need solutions for that. Is that what you?
Yes, it's what I mean. You mentioned Embraer, and I can mention also that in the 70s, we were importing energy, for example, and then we found oil in the Brazilian coast, and we developed the technology to exploit in deep sea, and then in more deep sea, how you say that?
Yeah, the pre-salt layer.
Yeah,
so
the
deep
pre-salt.
sea, very deep.
Even if we have all these crises, Brazil it's an amazing country, right? Because we are still one of the biggest economies in the world. And I fully believe that we are building together, even if we have different positions sometimes, the new framework that will allow us to grow, to develop, and to finally include our population, to give social justice and quality of life for our population.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Christopher. We had a chance to talk in, let's say, we had different occasions to talk, and you come with this amazing perspective from being a councilman in East London to overseeing economic foresight for the European Union, being here in Greece as the representative for the European Commission. What have you learned from different crises that you have experienced that you would like to share with everybody?
Well, thank you for inviting me here. I must say this is the most extraordinary conference that I've been to, and I think it's maybe the first time that I can actually talk about what I do rather than what the Greek government has or hasn't been doing recently. Because I'm an economist and I'm a policymaker, but actually, to be honest, I'm a troubleshooter. So let's say crises find me. And indeed, I've been a local councillor in the East End of London. I was a university lecturer in the UK on development economics and worked on the Brazilian economy. I was the first head of economic forecasting at the European Central Bank. And actually, for the last 7 years, I've been the EU economic representative here, trying to help Greece negotiate its way out of an economic crisis. No, look, I have a clear perspective on this. A crisis is a moment when people are more open to change, where progress and compromises are possible, and where you can start to solve the really difficult problems and difficult and insoluble problems of society. Now, actually, I discovered this for the first time maybe 30 years ago. I was in a meeting in a small housing office in East London, and there were two sets of tenants. I was the local councillor, and there were two sets of tenants in the office arguing with each other. And outside, the local youth were burning tyres. There was quite a lot of tension. Now, okay, they were arguing. It was a very run-down estate. There was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of vandalism. There was a lot of crime. But they were blaming each other for the problems and also blaming the council. And I was the representative of. All of a sudden, one of the local youth actually, presumably through a dare or something, actually comes in the housing office. And I say to him, why don't you sit down? Tell us what you think is the problem. And he says, well, there's nothing to do around here. We're all bored. And suddenly, all the tenants start attacking him. And I'll allow this to happen for a while. And then I sort of sit back and say, look, are you really blaming your own children? Is that the problem in the estate?
And it was quite remarkable. Despite all the differences, people started talking to each other. And I think from that experience, by the end of the discussion, I was able to say, look, why don't you form a tenants association? Then you can actually start to do something about your problem collectively. Why don't we try to rearrange the open space in the estate so there's somewhere for people to play football, so there's something for the local youth to do. And by the way, if you form a tenants association and you get together, we'll go to the British government and ask for some money to sort out the problems of the estate. And most extraordinarily, that's what happened. They formed the tenants association, they started to work with each other. We got £40 million from the UK government to do up the estate. And not only just doing up the estate, we even managed to get a sort of computer training centre, which was part of the estate, and actually started providing the opportunity for people to get jobs in the City of London, which was not far away. So what do I draw from this? I mean, obviously, I've been involved in many crises. I think 2015 in Greece with Mr. Varoufakis, and after Mr. Varoufakis was perhaps one of the biggest. But I think what should we draw from this is, I think, the most important thing. And I mean, the lessons I would say is, obviously, first of all, really a crisis is where people realize it's necessary to do something. They're willing to compromise. They're willing to think. But they need, I think, a bit of help to do that. And I think I have 2 or 3 thoughts on that. I think the first thing is that you've got to be very calm. You've got to be very stoic. I was talking to Mr. Hamaguchi, who's talking about surgeons. In a way, a surgeon is dealing with crisis every single day. And that's what surgeons have to be. They've got to be calm. They've got to be transparent. They've got to be they've got to build trust with their clients. So the first thing is, you personally have got to have a role in this. Secondly, some leadership is needed. You need to have some leadership to actually start a dialogue, to bring together collective efforts, to come up with some basic ideas, which then people can elaborate into a strategy, into some sort of solution, something that everybody can get around, where everybody is learning and where everybody is giving something, but also taking something. And I think at that point, you can start to challenge assumptions, to do things that you would never have believed to be possible. And I would perhaps just end with 2015. We had in Greece, we had a referendum here. We had capital controls, all the banks were shut for weeks. We had a European Council meeting where it wasn't clear whether Greece would fall out of the Eurozone or not. And I have to say that immediately after that, and after the decision by the European Council to keep Greece in, we then had to see, well, what can we do? And I think what was very extraordinary about that moment was that we all learnt something quite important. I think on one side, the Greeks learnt, well, prudent fiscal policy is important. Maybe taxes have to go up. Maybe privatization has to happen to get some money to actually restart investment. And on the other side, I have to say, the European Commission, because it was us in the end who had to try to sort out the problem, realized that yes, there was a problem. There wasn't a proper social safety net. After a year's unemployment, people didn't have any money. If you lose your job, ultimately you lose access to healthcare. This had to be dealt with. What about paying taxes? Well, actually, to be honest, the tax service was rather corrupt. Actually, the tax service needed to be made independent, and an attack on the internal corruption of the tax service was needed. We managed to do that. And we managed to find some resources from all the other countries in Europe to actually help the Greek administration on all these different policies to strengthen what they did. And I must say, it was most remarkable thing, a very left-wing government and the European Commission working together over what was 4 years to actually make reforms. But I think what happened there has allowed what's happened now in Greece, as you heard, which is to relaunch Greece as a place for investment, for human capital, and where people actually want to come and live here rather than leaving. So that's what I've learned. So these are the moments. These are the liminal moments where things happen. That's what happens in a crisis. And the more that we can learn from each other about these different crises, whether we're economists, whether we're doctors, surgeons, or technologists, I think that we also all need to try to learn from each other about how crises can be resolved, and of course what we can do in the future too.
You gave me a different perspective, and there's a question that comes to my mind. The different perspective is like this. In many cases we talk crisis and change, and listening to all of you, and especially what you have highlighted, Christopher, there's a chain, a cause and effect chain. You have crisis. Before change happens, we need a change in mindset. So in between really is this moment when you said people are more open, yeah? And that is, you need the frameworks, the processes, the tools for dialogue in place in that moment to catalyze a shift in mindset. And that may cause a real change in reality, right? So there's a cause and effect chain here in this process. The question that comes to my mind, I like science fiction as Chad Evans. Maybe I don't read as much as he does. Yeah, probably not. I've been reading things about the summit recently, right? Not science fiction. But I think we more and more have evidence that science fiction can drive and is driving change in reality. We get inspiration about longevity. We get inspiration about the stars. And lots of entrepreneurs are building the solutions to materialize those future visions. We heard from Rushdie and others about the future. So the question that comes to my mind is, are there any potential solutions or things that we could create to simulate, like science fiction does in our minds, to simulate the need for change that we feel in a moment of crisis without having to deal with the hardship of crisis? Is there anything that comes to your mind as a process to do that?
Actually, yes. I think what is one of the things which, in fact, we're working on now, and I'm trying to work on now, is to sort of set up a negotiation process for an economic adjustment program. But to be honest, I think the same sort of exercise could be used more generally. And I think what would be very, very interesting is given we've set something up for economic adjustment, to actually allow in the room, let's say, technologists and surgeons and people from other backgrounds. Because what would be tremendously interesting would be to see how they see the problems, not how, let's say, the economists, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission see the problems. So I think this would be an extraordinary thing that I guess might be possible and would be tremendously interesting to do. So it's just off the top of my head, but
that's a great thought. And that's a cue for our higher education leaders here in the room. What training programs, boot camps, whatever learning experiences could be created to address that, or simulation, right?
Yeah.
And then I turn to you. It took me longer than I thought, but I really want to open for your questions. You now have heard from our 5 amazing panelists, and you understand, I hope, their perspectives. What would you ask them? What would you like to know in order for your organizations, your countries, your cities to be better prepared to innovate in periods of crisis? Questions? Hamaguchi-san. Dozo.
I understand that there are many types of crisis. And if you think it's crisis or not, depends on career experience, some part. And what I want to ask you is there any common principle, common method to mitigate the effect, yes or no? And if you answer yes, what is it? 2 questions.
Who's going to take that? You raise your hand, Ioannis, even in a shy way, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, I will not fully address that. I will just share a couple of thoughts, but others may also want to come in. I think what you are asking, the best way to probably try to do that would be to be better prepared for when the next crisis hits. Because what you're asking is how can we minimize the impact? So we need to stress test the systems to make sure that if and when the new crisis happens, we have a response mechanism in place that can quickly come in and try to minimize collateral damage. And this can apply to different sectors and different industries in different ways. But that would be my initial thinking as a reflection on your very valid comment.
George. Oh, sorry.
Oh, George. Just 2 thoughts. I mean, the first thought is I think stress testing is a really important and good idea because, of course, if you can actually work out the exact nature or the possibility of the shock, then of course you can prepare better. But alongside that, and I think the thing that actually just participating in this conference has made clear to me is this idea that we should also get used to how you can deal with a shock when it actually happens. And I think that by having the experience of different fields and different areas, we get a much better idea of how you should deal with the shock. Because the problem is often time. How quickly you react makes a difference to how how big the crisis becomes. And of course, rapid reaction is very important. So therefore, actually sort of doing a bit of training and thinking about how to react is very, very important. I think these are things that we can learn. But I'd be tremendously interested in learning how different people deal with these things. I mean, I have a crisis, say, every few months. Surgeons have a crisis every week.
George.
Okay, let me respond to that in a stone-cold manner, if I may. Crises do exist. All systems break down. There is no system in any science or nation that the system will not break down. So crisis is part of any working, living organism, nation, engineer, whatever. So we have to live with that, and the only way out, as I can see that, is accept that the crisis will take place, so you have to fix it very, very quickly, update, upgrade, or change it, and move forward. There is no reason crying over spoiled milk, as we say. As soon as a crisis will happen, just follow a process of fixing that and move forward. Sorry for being so stone cold, but that's my way of approaching, industrial or national crisis.
Jenna.
that answering your question, I believe that we need to change from a culture of competition for a culture of cooperation and maintain all the channels for cooperation always very open. Because when the crisis come, and it always comes, we need to cooperate with each other. No way to solve the problems by ourselves.
Don't get isolated. Diplomacy. Shimada-san.
Yeah, I took a thought from Mr. Holiday. He said, think why we are now doing this, not what or how to do that. And to think about the purpose of our activities or vision of our activity is very important in order to accept the crisis and move forward. And as well, getting the bird's eye view of the crisis is also important because the day before yesterday, we had a meeting of GFCC annual meeting. And at that time, everyone talked about several crises, about the materials or climate change, or workforce shortage, but interconnection of such kind of crisis has not been discussed. And so if we understand, if we put ourselves into the shoes of others, such kind of opportunities might be very nice to understand the crisis deeply and move quickly.
Other questions or comments? Jim.
I was interested in your insights into fast crises versus slow crises, because Shimada-san and we are used to earthquakes, for example, very damaging earthquakes, but the response is almost autopilot. And you can look back at the preparation for that being, retrofitting, strengthening in buildings, teaching people how to respond. But what's really hurting us now is our slow crises in terms of, for example, the impact of inflation on economic well-being of people. It's a highly differential impact across different parts of society, and it's tearing our societies apart. But it is quite different to responding to an earthquake. It's a slow crisis. Similarly, climate change. So I'm interested in how you view the different types of responses which are needed for those.
You asked about slow and fast crisis, and I'm sorry to tell you guys, your answers cannot be on the slow side, only the fast side, because we're running out of time. Who's going to take that?
I would take that first. About my comments, most of my former comment is about the fast crisis, think advance, why we are now doing. But about the slow crisis, getting the bird's eye view map is very important, I think. So objective-oriented thinking might be good for fast crisis, and understanding the situation carefully might be a good for slow crisis. This might.
Chris.
Okay, just two quick things. On inflation, I guess the thing is you need two instruments, not just interest rates, but you need something from governments to protect the more vulnerable people. And the second thing is these slow-moving crises are exactly where you need to change social perceptions. And that's why you need to start thinking about the social as well as the technical. Thanks.
We do like this. We have 20 seconds. So we'll go a bit over. We'll take two questions here, and let's bundle the answer, and let's consider that our lightning round, our last round here. Please identify yourself.
My name is George Karapoulis. I'm not a member. I heard about the sourcing close to where your needs are. And And I think we need to also look at the negative impact of that it would have on poor countries. Because in essence, wealth transfer happens when you move things where poverty is. And I think we have to be very careful. If I was from Africa, I would really worry about a European or US moving close to their borders and not helping out. As far as change, having managed organizations for about 40 years, changed, you have to look at an organization like a human being. Crises happen in a human life. Crises happen in an organization. What are the two key elements of dealing with crisis? Ethics and community. And I think I like your comment where you said, crisis, moments of crisis, we need to deal with community response rather than individual response. It was commentary, not questions.
So let's turn, please identify yourself.
Another thing is, just because there are industry confederations here, I hope that the next GIS is about circular economy and how industries will deal with the crisis of the lack of critical materials resources. What are they doing about re-engineering, remanufacturing, reusing? You know, all those, these will be a huge crisis, I think. And they have to re-engineer their manufacturing.
Kande, I noticed that you wanted to add something. We got a comment from Africa, and that's right on the spot on relation to what you raised yesterday. So.
I just wanted to concur that thank you. Because of crisis, don't just look inwards, right? There are relationships you've built. But I was going to ask my Greece colleagues on the panel. You know, the whole 3 days, I only hear of your relationship with the rest of Europe, but you're sitting in the Mediterranean. What about your neighbors in North Africa? No partnerships with them?
Let's go for your final round, considering the perspectives that we got here. Who wants to? George, you first.
Excellent comment on circular economy. Just one minor indicator. In 30 years, in order to maintain the modern way of life, we will need 3 planets of natural resources in order to sustain the way we live today. It's very critical to address that, and I fully agree with your comment.
Any solutions for that?
But I think that's the topic of the next GIS conference.
Okay.
So you have to invite him again to be able to actually share that.
Over to you, Ioannis.
Very quickly on 2 comments. Fast versus slow, I think a slow crisis can have a bigger impact than a fast crisis, and this needs much better management than a fast crisis. On Africa and least developed countries more generally, and developing countries more generally, as an academic, I think academia is working with universities and partners across the globe. We do, for a fact. We have partners in Nigeria, Ghana, and many other countries in Africa in particular. And we should not just be focusing on developed countries, because there's developing and then there's the LDCs as well. And all of them are part of the same globe.
Well, Brazil, we have been cooperating with Africa. But I believe that we can develop more cooperation, mainly with this new government elected. On eco-innovation, this subject, I think that it's very complex. I think that we don't have time to discuss it here, but just to invite you, next year, we will organize an innovation summit in Brazil, and we always have the partnership of GFCC. So I invite you to come to Brazil, and we can discuss this subject there.
Chris.
Just to answer Candace's very apt comment. Actually, I'm a representative of the European Commission in Greece, which is why I was talking about Greece. But in fact, obviously, as you know, the Commission and also Greece have reached out a lot to Africa. I have to say that my first job was working on a Economic Community for West Africa with Mr. Jonathan Frimpong Ansah in 1983. And every 10 years, our study gets dug out again by the IMF or World Bank or ECOWAS. And I hope this will ultimately happen.
Shimada-san.
Yeah, I would like to say, shall we work together in the project, innovating in and out of crisis, discussing and acting about this crisis issue? Because this is a part of a community building activities among us and trust building activities among us. So let's work together, combining our resources, concrete resources each other in the venue of GFCC. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございます。5 quick things. We need institutional learning. We should use crisis as an opportunity to break trade-offs that happens, challenging assumptions, redesigning systems. We need dialogue platforms. If everything is burning, we need to keep talking. We need to institutionalize that. We need diplomacy. We need to not break the bridges or burn the bridges in times of crisis. And crises are moments when we can have a shift in the mindset. So there's a cause and effect chain. The thing is, there's also an opportunity here. And I think we need crisis training. If I'm not wrong, maybe you know that, Deborah, Chad, or other colleagues, I think it costs around $5 million to train one Navy SEAL. So we need to train the special ops teams at a scale, at low cost, to be ready for the future. Here's the challenge. Yeah?
And I also think that we need new leaders. We need to train and open the space for new leaders. The world needs new leaders.
And Kande, I think that COP30 will be in the Amazon. So maybe also another opportunity. It was a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much. A big round of applause.
Thank you. For an excellent presentation.
And now I would like to invite our president of the GFCC, Deborah Winston-Smith, to close our summit. And again, this was an amazing resilience exercise, guys.